the Once and Future Present Episode 10, Renaissance, Women, Impact and Reality, a Hammer History production. Welcome back to The Once and Future Present, where we dig into the past to better understand the present. I'm your host, Casey Brooks, and today we're asking a big question. Did the Renaissance change the lives of women? As always, I'm joined by Professor Theo, our resident expert on social and intellectual history.
Always happy to be here, Casey.
And Dr. Morgan, who handles the political and economic side of things. Welcome back, both of you.
Ready to stir up some trouble with historical debate.
I love it. So let's get into it. I've been reading these 3 essays for class, one by Mary R. Beard, one by Margaret L. King, and another by Joan Kelly Goodall. Beard and King say women did benefit from the Renaissance, and Kelly Goodall says, not so fast. So which one of them is right?
That's the joy of historiography. It's not just about what happened, but how we interpret it. Beard, writing in the 1940s, focused on elite women who engaged in humanist learning. Margaret King expands this view in the 1990s by examining women in religious, domestic, and intellectual settings, emphasizing that many developed a new awareness of themselves as thinkers and patrons.
But Joan Kelly Goodall pushes back hard. She lays out a structural critique using 4 criteria: regulation of female sexuality, economic and political roles, access to education and cultural influence, and the ideology of gender. Her conclusion? Compared to medieval women, women in the Renaissance lost ground.
So King and Beard are kind of saying, look at these incredible women. And Kelly Goodall is like, yeah, but what about all women?
Exactly. Beard and King do compensatory and contributory history.
Wait, before we go on, can one of you explain what compensatory and contributory history actually mean?
Sure. Compensatory history is about recovering women who were left out of the traditional narrative. It shows that they were there all along, just overlooked. Contributory history goes further by inserting women into the categories of traditional history, like politics, science, or the arts, to show they played meaningful roles. Beard and King do compensatory and contributory history. They highlight remarkable individuals like Isotta Nogarola, Olympia Morata, and Isabella d'Este. But Kelly Goodall digs into the structures beneath the surface. She asks, did women have a renaissance? And answers, no.
Her argument is that what looks like progress for a few actually masked a contraction of options for most. Women were excluded from political power, tied more tightly to domestic roles, and idealized in literature as passive and obedient, like in Castiglione's Book of the Courtier.
Oh yeah, I remember that part in McKay's textbook. Women had to be educated just enough to be charming, not threatening, beautiful, silent, and smart, but not too smart.
Exactly. That ideal of the graceful court lady was powerful but limiting. The ideal woman in Renaissance culture was there to inspire male greatness, not to pursue her own.
And that shift represents a real loss. In the Middle Ages, women like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Joan of Arc could command troops. Feudal structures gave some women leverage through kinship networks. The Renaissance centralized state power and made women less visible.
But didn't some women become powerful patrons, like Isabella d'Este and Catherine of Aragon?
Yes, and Margaret King emphasizes that. These women used their influence to sponsor art, education, and religious reform. Catherine of Aragon brought humanist tutors like Juan Luis Vives to England and advocated for women's learning.
But they were exceptions. For most women, the Renaissance reinforced gendered barriers. The rise of capitalist economies and humanist education actually narrowed opportunities. Kelly Goodall shows that Renaissance literature and philosophy presented a more restrictive vision of femininity than courtly love literature did in the medieval period.
That's such a twist. We usually think of the Renaissance as this super progressive moment.
It was progressive for elite men. Humanism was about developing one's talents to serve the state or community, but women couldn't access the public roles those educations prepared men for.
And the ideology reinforced it. Women were told they had different virtues: modesty, silence, grace. Their ideal was not the citizen, but the ornament. That's why Castiglione's ideal lady had to be educated, but only to charm.
So even if a woman was super smart, she could be criticized for being unwomanly?
Exactly. King even notes that highly educated women were often called Amazons, or accused of being unnatural.
That feels so unfair. But then what about art? Didn't Renaissance art celebrate women? I thought I heard of Artemisia Gentileschi.
Excellent example. Artemisia Gentileschi is one of the most famous female painters of the period. She painted powerful biblical and mythological women: Judith, Susanna, Cleopatra. But her path wasn't easy. She trained in her father's studio and had to overcome serious obstacles, including a public trial after she was assaulted by another painter.
And she was the exception, not the rule. Women like Sofonisba Anguissola or Lavinia Fontana were rare, and most female artists were daughters of painters or nuns. They often couldn't study nude models, which was essential for certain types of work, or join guilds that gave access to commissions. So even when women created art, their visibility and independence were tightly constrained. It celebrated images of women. The real women behind those images had little control. In fact, Renaissance art and literature helped lock in gender roles. The beauty and stillness of painted Madonnas or mythological goddesses matched the cultural ideal of women as passive and modest.
And this connects to how periodization works.
Wait, what do you mean by periodization?
Great question. Periodization is how historians divide time into different chunks, like the Renaissance, the Middle Ages, or the Enlightenment. But those labels don't always mean the same thing for everyone. Kelly Gadell is saying that if you define the Renaissance based on elite male experience, you miss how different it looked for women. Kelly Gadell argues that turning points in history, like the Renaissance, might mean different things for men and women. It challenges us to ask, whose experience are we using to define historical change?
So, is there any sense in which women had a renaissance?
I think King would say yes, not in the sense of equal empowerment, but in terms of intellectual self-awareness. Some women used the tools of humanism to question their roles and make space for themselves.
And Kelly Gadell would say that awareness was important, but it didn't translate to structural change. Women were still excluded from power, politics, universities, and most professions.
So, both views help us understand different parts of the picture?
Precisely. Beard and King recover voices that had been forgotten. Kelly Gadell gives us a framework to understand systems of exclusion.
And McKay's textbook helps connect this to broader patterns of power, education, and state building. It's all about perspective, and that's what historiography brings to the table.
I love that. Thanks for helping me see the bigger picture. This really shows how powerful the lens of history can be when we shift our focus. So, how do historians decide whose voices to prioritize when writing about the past?
That's where things get really thoughtful. Sometimes it depends on what sources survive: letters, books, legal documents. But it also depends on what questions historians are asking. In the early 20th century, historians focused on politics and battles, so they ignored most women. But when scholars started asking about daily life, education, or family, new kinds of evidence and new voices became part of the story.
And there's also a responsibility. Choosing to tell the story from the bottom up, from the perspective of marginalized groups, can challenge long-held myths. It's about who we think matters in history.
And that's the essence of historical thinking.
Looking at the past, not just as a story of great events, but as an evolving conversation about power, identity, and justice.
That's a wrap for today. Thanks for joining us on The Once and Future Present. Until next time, stay curious and think critically.